I'm going to invite Chris Evans to join us. Chris, welcome.
Thanks, Ellen.
So this is an area that you've got a lot of expertise in. You are an extension forester and research specialist with the University of Illinois Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Sciences. And you've had over 20 years of experience working with invasive plants, specializing in forest restoration and management of forest health. You're actually a native of Kentucky, from far eastern Kentucky, and a graduate of Murray State University. And you're going to be talking about a new invasive plant, Japanese chaff flower, which is increasing not just in Kentucky, but all over our region, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, and ever since I started looking for this, I have sadly seen it in a lot more places than I want to be seeing it. And so I think this whole segment here, our final segment of the day, is about new invaders to watch for. We have so many different invasive plants here in Kentucky, but these are some that are just increasing. And if you can catch it sooner, you can have a bigger impact than if you're trying to play catch up after it's already really spread. So I think these are ones that are really important to get on people's radar. So I appreciate you joining us today.
Oh, yeah. Happy to do it. Thanks, Ellen. Yeah. So Japanese chaff flower, I think it's at the edge of what we could call a new invader. It's been around for a while in Kentucky, but I think it's flown under the radar because it's such a plant that looks like everything else. It doesn't stand out. And so I think not a lot of people recognize it. But as Ellen said, it seems to be drastically increasing its range lately. So I think it's definitely worth hitting here and talking about. So Japanese chaff flower is Acaranthes japonica, and that literally translates to chaff flower from Japan. It's in the amaranth family, though it's a perennial, and it was first found actually in all of North America in eastern Kentucky in 1981. It has since spread throughout the Ohio River Valley. It's in a lot of other locations. We'll talk about that in a second. And this is a plant that I actually grew up with, although I didn't know what its name was. We knew it because of the seeds get stuck to you and causes a lot of problems. And it grew on the riverbanks and on the Tug Fork River and the Big Sandy River where I grew up. And so I was very familiar with this plant and quite surprised when I actually found out what it was years later in college. This is a plant that does prefer moist bottomlands, but really can grow in a wide variety of locations. So just jumping into identification, these are the major identification features, the characteristics you want to look for, and we'll look at each of them in a picture. But this is a perennial herbaceous forb, usually somewhere around 2 to 5 feet tall. As it ages, the older plants get multiple stems. So the older plants will have 2 or 3 or 4 stems kind of coming out of the same root collar. When they're young, it's usually just one stem coming up. And it has opposite entire leaves with really arching, obviously arching venation. And that to me is really stands out. It almost looks like a little dogwood leaf. The stems are pretty stout. And the nodes are inflated and reddish in color. And the flower is kind of a bottle brush like flower head, very compact at first, but as the plant continues to flower and develop seed, that flowering head really elongates and get quite long. The fruit, as they develop, kind of deflects and lay flat along the stem, and each fruit has a paired set of bracts that come from the base of the fruit, which really helps it hold on to clothes and fur and move around that way. And you can even identify this in the winter with this bright tan thatch. The leaves will die back and kind of wither away, but the stems and the fruit really hold on well into winter. So you can pick this out pretty much any month of the year. So you're looking at here just a couple of basic pictures of some smaller chaff flower that are starting to flower, but really focusing in on kind of all those characteristics. But to me, those arching veins and those entire opposite leaves really, to me, jump out as the biggest characteristic that I pick up first. You can also see this compact flower heads, but the interesting thing is the picture on the right, you can see that reddish color to the nodes, and it's not as obvious on the picture on the left. So there definitely is variation. Just some more of those characteristics to look at. You can see the red on the nodes. Those stems are often squarish, a little bit in cross section. You can see the entire leaves, the arching veins, the compact flower, the bottle brush look to it there. And then again, some more variation on the reddish of the nodes. You can see the nodes are typically inflated or swelled a little bit. Really a kind of a squarish cross stem as well, square stem and cross section. And then if you look at the base of the plant, pretty thick lower stems are often reddish as well. And then you can see this is a plant here that has two stems coming out of the ground, but it also branches lower to the ground with separate ones there. So an older individual plant can get quite wide, 3 or 4 or 5 feet wide, with all these multiple stems coming out of it. And then just more close-up look at the flower. You can see again compact. The newly developing flowers are on the top, and then the older flowers here on the bottom. You can see they're open, the couple on the bottom, and then right below them are some that are actually turning into fruit at that point. And then on the left here, you can see a fully open flower with the 5 petals, 5 stamens there. So it does have just a dull green. If you look at it close, it's actually kind of pretty. But that real noticeable where young developing flower buds on the top, you have a ring of open flowers, and then below the open flowers, which is visible on the one on the right, you have the fruit starting to mature and produce. As this flower moves along and gets more and more more fruit and less flowers, more in the season, the fruit develop, then you get what looks like here on the left, where you have a lot of fruit, the really elongated stem, and then at the top you have developing fruit and then a few flowers on the top. And this kind of happens throughout that early fall season, where you'll get those compact flowers, and then slowly it transitions to these long fruiting spikes. You take a closer look at the fruit, you can see here it's those paired bracts that come from the base of the fruit, look like little bullhorns. Really, really stand out to me. And again, that's how it moves around. It hooks those little bracts into clothes, fur, anything like that to spread around. Later in the season, this is what a whole plant looks like after most of the flowers have moved, and now it's basically all fruiting spikes, and they really are noticeable on the top of the plant and stands out that way. So in the mid to late fall, it really, really is easy to pick out just by that massive fruiting spikes. And again, those persist even into the winter. You can see most of the leaves have withered away here, but the bright chaff color and then the fruiting spikes on top of the plant. You can see more of them here, really noticeable. Even when this plant is very young, you can see there's a few flowers on that one. Again, it's single stemmed. As it gets older, multiple stemmed, multiple flowering as well. And then even in the seedling stage, it really jumps out, and you're looking for those opposite leaves, the arching venation. And you see this a lot where you'll have just a mat or a carpet of seedlings kind of on the ground. And then big infestations. This is under a pine stand here, but you can see just those flowers jump out, and pretty much everything you're looking at in this picture is chaff flower. And then here is a little later at the forest edge, and you can see all the fruiting spikes jumping out. Probably the biggest look-alike that you're likely to come across would be lopseed. The leaves are opposite, but they're very serrated, so that's different. But in the fall, you may find the fruiting spikes of lopseed look very similar, but if you notice, there's no bracts coming out of the base of their fruit from lopseed, and also lopseed fruit tends to be oppositely arranged along the stem, whereas chaff flower is alternately arranged. In terms of the phenology of this plant, it has a really long germination window. It'll germinate, seeds will germinate anywhere from spring even through midsummer. Flowering typically starts either late summer or early into fall. Late July or early August here, where I'm at in the lower Midwest, maybe even mid to late August at some years. The fruit mature early fall, mid to late September, and then senescence starts October or early November is kind of where you start seeing it die back for the year. This plant does prefer moist, well-drained, rich bottomland soils, riparian areas. Bottomland forest is where you really see it, though it does not like to have its feet wet. So it's not found in true wetlands or areas with long periods of inundation. Along our river systems, you can kind of see that difference between areas that flood a lot and areas that only flood occasionally. That seems to be where chaff flower infestations stop, is where it's really frequent flooding. It doesn't seem to grow well there. Outside of that, it grows pretty much anywhere. I've seen it in dry uplands, growing out of the cracks in concrete, growing in top of cliffs. It is moderately shade tolerant, though it does prefer edge habitat with partial sun, seems to be where it really does best. But it can grow everywhere from deep shade to full sun. And it really, really likes disturbed sites. So roadsides, fence rows, yards, flower beds, old fields, that seems to be in that kind of full sun or partial sun area with a lot of disturbance, really where it seems to thrive. Again, here's a forest edge. Here's a ditch where it's growing in with a lot of other plants, but doing very well. You can see all the fruit it's producing. Here's some growing up in a flower bed. And here's some growing up in a fence row or at the edge of an old concrete pad. It really does kind of grow anywhere. It tends to have very high seed production. In those highest infestations, we've recorded seeds up to 11,000 seeds per square meter. So it produces a ton of seed. The seed seems to be very, very viable, with the majority of them being viable and being able to germinate that first year. We don't have any data yet on seed banking potential or how long these seeds can live in the soil, but we hope to get that in the coming years. In terms of impacts, it forms dense, near monoculture populations, potential to displace native species and dominate our native ecosystems. So again, just some pictures showing some heavier chaff flower infestations. Just one here, you can see we're moving through. But it is browsed by deer quite heavily. It doesn't seem to impact it as well. Another heavy infestation kind of in a flatwoods ecosystem, under pines, all of this. Here's where we know that it's located based upon our current data. Again, all along the Ohio River Valley, now down into the Mississippi River Valley. There's one new population that popped up in Canada, and then kind of spread elsewhere, and a big and growing population in the Atlanta area. And you can see, if you look at kind of the year, kind of how fast this is moving. First found in the early 80s in Eastern Kentucky, and then rapidly made it all the way to Illinois by 2008. And then now it's all the way down into Arkansas and Mississippi. So really fast spreading, now found in 11 states and 1 province, 75 counties. There's 725 records in EDMAPS and another 254 observations from North America in iNaturalist. This is likely already present in every county adjacent to the Ohio River. Honestly, downstream from the Ohio-Kentucky border, and probably much more widespread in Kentucky than is indicated by our current records, though it is actively spreading. So definitely looking for it and finding it can be a management strategy. We expect these satellite populations to continue to grow, continue to spread down the Mississippi River, and this idea of long distance spread has a lot of potential, because those seeds grab onto your clothes and hang on. So there's a lot of human-aided spread. Dog fur, animal fur is definitely another way it can move around. So that means these high-risk situations for spread would be recreational areas where people frequent and move through. Roadside mowing can move it. Streamside infestations, because it does seem to move well with water. In terms of management, A big one is spread prevention, keeping those seeds off your clothing, off your shoes, fur, off equipment. Mechanical doesn't seem to be a great option because it maybe for smaller stems with the larger plants tend to break at ground level instead of pulling up. We've found variable responses for fire. Sometimes it does seem to have some effect and lower the populations, but overall not significantly. And there's a lot of options for herbicides. And that's the nice thing about chaff flower is that pretty much most of the herbicides we've tested on it seem to be very, very effective. And so whether it's some of the broadleaf ones or glyphosates or anything like that at kind of normal rates seems to work well at controlling chaff flower. The key would be it has that long germination window and that late development of plants. That means that you have to do a lot of retreatments. And so we will treat kind of midsummer, and a lot of the smaller plants will kind of be hiding under the other plants or hiding under other species. And so we just don't see them and we'll miss them. So we have to come back once or twice to get those as they're starting to flower. And so we find that kind of multiple treatments in a season, starting midsummer, working through early fall, tends to be the best at getting this plant under control. You're definitely going to need multiple years of treatment, and then repeat treatments because of the spread is so aggressive. It's moving from adjacent areas, particularly for floodplain infestations where it's going to just reinfest with floodwaters. So it's something I think we can get a handle on if it's new. If it's very bad infestation, it's going to take a lot of work, but it's definitely something to keep an eye out for moving forward. So with that, yeah, I'm happy to take questions if anybody has them.
Wonderful. Thank you, Chris. And if you're interested in learning more about chaff flower, I really recommend you check out a conference that Chris, you recently hosted
Mhm.
on chaff flower. You can find those recordings and recorded kind of virtual field trips as well on your website.
That's right. Yep. Just extension.illinois.edu/forestry. And we have a lot of information on chaff flower.
We did have a couple questions that kind of popped up in the Q&A, and maybe we could address some of those really quickly before we move on to our next speaker. One question, how did it find its way to the US? And then the other question, have people had success with treating heavy or dense infestations? And if so, what does that look like?
Okay. So the first one about how did it get here? We don't really know since it was first found along the Tug River and along some railroad tracks. We think it was an accidental introduction, a hitchhiker, contaminant on some shipping, but we don't actually know that. It has some medicinal uses and it is used medicinally where it's native to in parts of Asia. And even in North America, there's some people that use it medicinally. So it could have been introduced initially as a medicinal plant. We just really don't know the exact reasons why. We just know that's kind of where we first found it. In terms of success controlling heavy infestations, there has been some. It does take quite a bit of work. I mean, doing basically broadcast spraying for a couple years and then trying to get a healthy native community coming in there. I will say it's difficult to do that. We've been working on it a lot here at the Ag Center where I work in Southern Illinois, and we've had some success in areas, but at the same time, there's other areas that we're losing ground. So it is a difficult one because of just how much seed it produces and how quick it spreads. But no, I think you can have success if you're willing to do some repeat treatments in the year and then look at multiple years of treatment.
And, both chaff flower and the next species we're going to hear about, lesser celandine, are, really common in those riparian areas. So one of the questions that came up in the chat is concern about using herbicide along waterways and what's the recommended way to treat in those areas. And I know that both you and Matt Spalding, our next speaker, have a lot of experience with that. Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I can, and I can let Matt put in his 2 cents as well. It is a concern, right? If you're in close to water, you definitely don't want to do anything to impact our aquatic ecosystems. In that case, if you're right on the stream side or in an area where applying herbicide is likely to get into the water fairly soon after spraying. You can use aquatic labeled herbicides. There's definitely a lot of versions out there that would be effective for chaff flower and potentially lesser celandine that are designed and deemed safe for use in aquatic systems. So I would use those in those situations. If you're just in a regular floodplain ecosystem, but not adjacent to the water, as long as flooding is not expected in the near future, just within a few days, you can use herbicides in those cases, and they wouldn't necessarily have to be labeled for aquatic use as long as you're away from standing water. And water's not like you're not expecting flood waters in the next in the near future, in the next week or so. And the reason why is a lot of those herbicides, particularly the ones that we would typically use for chaff flower, bind with organic matter fairly quickly, break down fairly quickly. So as long as that immediate risk isn't there, you don't necessarily have to use aquatic labeled ones unless you're adjacent to the water.
Wonderful, thank you. If you have more questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A for Chris, or make sure to check him out online. It's got some great resources there with the University of Illinois about chaff flower and other invasive species. So, just really appreciate you joining us today, Chris.
Oh, thanks. Happy to.